Good morning, guys. Okay, today we are going to read chapter 13 and 14, and then on Monday we'll do the end of the book. Okay, so we're very, very close to finishing this book. This is part 4, and part 4 is when they go to Buchenwald, okay, which is another concentration camp. So, here, let's go ahead and get started. Again, I am sitting on a train. It is not a freight car. It is not an open wagon. I sit on a seat. I gaze out the window at the scenery flashing by. It's spring, and I have just turned 18. And once more, I decided to go through my pictures to organize everything so I can remember. This time, some of the pictures are in my head. Some I hold in my hand. The first ones are those in my head. The first picture I see is the large hall where we were taken after our arrival at Buchenwald. We were fed some soup and told we would stay there for 3 weeks of quarantine. In a way, this wasn't such a terrible time. We were fed, if little. We didn't have to work, and it was not too cold in the room because of all the bodies. Peter was there, and we spent much of the time talking, telling each other our stories. We gained back a little of our strength. When we were finally put into the regular camp, it was an unpleasant shock. The inmates in our barracks were very rough, and every night there were terrible fights between the Ukrainians and the Poles. We discovered that this was the camp where most political prisoners were sent. The communists and socialists Hitler hated so much. Quickly, Father tried to organize jobs for us. One day we were both called to the main camp. I see photo after photo in my head. The Nazis had created a little paradise for themselves with grassy parks, beautiful lodges, even a zoological garden filled with pampered animals. It was quite unbelievable to see such beauty amid the squalor of the barracks. Father was put to work in our carpentry workshop making ornate furniture for SS men. I was taken to a photography studio where I was ordered to take photos of guards and their families on request. An older inmate ran the studio and he needed an assistant. His name was Karl, and he was a political prisoner, not a Jew. He'd been in Buchenwald since 1939. He was a communist, and I found out later a member of the resistance in Buchenwald. Buchenwald did have a crematorium to burn the many that died of disease, torture, medical experiments, and so on. But it was not a killing center like Auschwitz-Birkenau. Nevertheless, men died quickly there from the terrible conditions. I can see the picture of the first clients who came into our studio shortly after I arrived. There was a tall, fair SS man. Here, fair, we're talking about his skin color. He's really, really white. SS man with his tall, blonde wife and their 2 blonde, blue-eyed children. The children, both girls, were dressed in frilly white dresses, probably stolen from some poor dead Jewish family, I thought. The mother in a stylish blue dress and high heels. The father in his SS uniform. They arranged themselves smartly for the camera and followed Carl's instructions to the letter. They looked so content, so well fed, the model of a perfect family. The father kissed the children pleasantly when the pictures were taken. The model father. Later that day, I was running an errand for Carl, going to pick up some chemicals he needed from another building. A young boy, he couldn't have been more than 13, was sweeping the walkway. The SS officer whose picture Carl had just taken informed the boy that he'd missed a piece of dirt. The child ran to sweep it up. The SS man shot him in the leg. With a cry, the child fell forward. "Get up and keep working," the officer yelled. The child dragged himself up and continued to sweep. The officer shot him in the other leg. "Get up! Get working, you lazy idiot!" the officer screamed. The child tried, but obviously he couldn't get up. The officer emptied his gun into the child's body. I was frozen to the spot just behind them, my whole body trembling with both anger and fear. I knew very well that I could be next, and in fact, he did turn and see me. "Clean that up," he ordered as he walked off. The loving father, 2 children of his own, and yet he was capable of that. I felt so sick, I thought I would vomit. But before I could do anything, 2 camp capos rushed out and took the body away, leaving me standing there in the street. I quickly came to my senses and ran to get the chemicals for Carl. When I got back, I told him what I'd seen. I was so distraught that I lost all senses of caution and told him of my use of photography at Auschwitz. "Well, well," he said. "I'm glad to hear that, Daniel. There's plenty of work here. There is plenty of work here for those who want to be part of the resistance. You and your father could be very useful. You say you are good at taking apart machinery and the like. My father and I can put together or take apart almost anything," I said. "What is your barracks number?" he asked. 34. "Be waiting outside after everyone is asleep. Someone will come get you." He paused. "Are you willing?" "Yes," I said. "I'll do anything." We spent the rest of the day taking pictures of perfect German families. Chapter 14. This photo is clear in my mind. Out of the dark rises the specter of bricks, wood, shadows, and the moonlight. Spirits seem to pass in and out of these shadows. The walls seem to shrink as time goes on. Father and I waited as instructed outside our barracks. Soon, a capo came to fetch us. We slipped in and out of the shadows. He always seemed to know where the guards would be and how to avoid them. We arrived at a building site in the main camp. The capo whispered to us, "That fellow over there has tools. You are to dismantle anything you can find." We went over to the man with the tools. He gave us small flashlights as well. "They have decided to build a gas chamber here," he whispered to us. "The Allies are very close. We can't let them do it." Father and I Father and I each took a hammer, and we slowly and methodically began to take the nails out of the boards and lay them on the ground. We worked for around 2 hours before being taken back to our barracks. Twice we had to hide behind huge piles of materials as German guards checked the site. We both kept as many nails and small bits of materials as we could, to barter later. Father had already developed a busy trade with the SS. In exchange for warm clothes and food, he made them beautiful pieces of small furniture, ornate chairs, and tables. They sent these back to their families for their homes. Often, though, He had somehow to find his own materials, so these nails were very valuable to him. At work the next day, Carl said, "How did it go?" "Very well," I replied. "I would do anything," I added, "to make sure that a gas chamber is never built here." "Fortunately, most of the workers feel the same way," he replied. "They realize that they are building their own death. They work very slowly during the day, although they make it seem as if they are working furiously hard. Then we dismantle it at night. At this rate, it'll never get built before the Allies get here." "Do you have a radio?" I asked. "Of course," he grinned. "Would you like to come and listen one night?" I told him that I would, and so one evening after work he arranged for me to accompany him to a small hut. There, a group of 5 men sat around a radio, and I was able to listen to the BBC for the first time in months. Was it only months ago that I had been taken to Auschwitz? It felt like I had left Lodz years ago. But now it was February 1945, and the Allies were close. So close. Would they get to us in time to save us? "Don't worry," one of the men said. "We have plans. We won't let them kill us all just before the Allies get here. We have some weapons. We'll fight if we have to." That reassured me a bit. The prospect that terrified me most was being shot by the Nazis the day before our liberation. Now I see picture after picture of the camp. If only I could have had my camera to take pictures of what I witnessed. Buchenwald was a concentration camp with factories. Its purpose, forced labor rather than mass extermination. Everyone worked 14 hours a day. There was roll call every morning. Sometimes we would have to stand for hours in the early morning as they counted and recounted us. I see someone being taken away because he is missing a button on his jacket. He is shot. I see a man beaten almost to death because he did not salute an SS officer. I see 7 young men, Poles, who tried to escape. They were tied to their cots and fed nothing but salt water. Their screams echoed throughout the camp for 3 days until the screams became moans and they died. I see the children from the medical facilities wandering the grounds. Carl told me that all kinds of horrible experiments were done on them and on adults too. They all died eventually. And actually, guys, there are a lot of articles on the experiments of Dr. Mengel or Mendel. Can't remember if it's a D or a G, but they called him the Angel of Death because he performed many experiments, and all, if not all of the subject, a lot of the people that he did the experiments on died. So I'm not sure if we'll have time to read an article on that, but if anything, I'll just see if I can find a video and link it for you guys. I see the luxury and opulence of the living quarters of the SS who ran Buchenwald. Often, Carl and I would be ordered to take pictures in a lodge or the zoological gardens. The wealth and lavishness was astonishing. I see the tent cities set up for prisoners outside the main camp. I see the concert the children gave. They sang beautiful, moving songs, and the SS sat in the front row and didn't react. Perhaps they didn't understand. The children sang in Polish, German, Russian, and I saw that the human spirit was not dead. Not yet. Somehow, Father and I struggled through March. My official job at the studio came to an end because everything in the camp was becoming chaotic. The Allies were close. The Germans knew it was all over. They no longer had time to come to the studio and pose for pictures. In fact, the last thing they wanted was proof, in the form of photos of them in uniform, that they had been at Buchenwald. Many of them were taking the ranks insignia of their uniforms or dumping their uniforms altogether. Carl gave me a camera. Salud, mi amor. Carl gave me a camera, though, and told me to take pictures of whatever I could so there would be a record. He gave me the camera on my 18th birthday as a present. I look at the picture in my hand. It was April 2nd. I managed to take it from the window of my studio. Rows of Jewish prisoners being marched out of Buchenwald, perhaps to their immediate death, perhaps to other camps. Why are you letting this happen? I demanded of Carl, who was a member of the camp resistance group, one of its organizers, in fact. The Germans ordered we supply them with 4,500 Jews, he replied. We're not strong enough to fight them yet. There are 3,000 guards here. You didn't even try, I scoffed. You don't care about us any more than the SS does. That's not true, Carl replied. To us, everyone is equal. Of course, I replied sarcastically. I believe you. April 4th was Passover, the celebration of the liberation of the Jews from Egypt, where Pharaoh kept them as slaves thousands of years ago. That night, a group of religious Hasidic Jews held a seder in our barracks where they chanted the Haggadah by heart. Everyone who could crowded around, and somehow the memory of past suffering and the fact that our ancestors had survived it gave us courage to try to survive our present suffering. Okay, so basically, well, no, not basically. So Jews have been persecuted for, thousands of years. Back in the times of like Egypt, también los tenían como esclavos a los judíos. Y ahora pasaron el holocausto. So anyway, he's just making reference to that. ¿Dónde me quedé? Oh, the service always ends with next year in Jerusalem, and that line rang throughout the barracks as we all said it as a prayer for ourselves and for each other. Still, on April 6th, another 8,000 were marched out, non-Jews as well as Jews. Shortly after that, we could hear the fighting as it passed very close to us. Planes buzzed overhead. Cannon shells and artillery fire exploded near the camp. The Americans are going after the escaping SS, Carl told me. They seem to have forgotten about us here. Come to the hut tonight. We're organizing a rebellion. We won't just let the Nazis massacre us all. That night, we were each given a firearm to hide. On April 10th, we were all driven from our barracks and massed in the courtyard for evacuation. I wondered how I was going to get my gun. I had hidden it in the studio after Carl had showed me how to use it. I was sure we would be massacred without getting a chance to fight when suddenly the air raid siren wailed and the Germans returned us to the barracks so they could head for cover. They were scared. You could see it in their faces. Father and I did not return to the barracks. On instruction, we hid in the studio. The next morning, the Nazis again got everyone together for evacuation. Father and I were told to hide near the gates. Our job was to disarm. Our job was to disarm or kill the guards there. Our signal was the first explosion of a grenade. Disarm, to take away their arms, their weapons. Ay, ¿cómo es eso? Okay. We crouched behind a building near the gate. My heart pounded. I was sweating so much. The gun felt slippery in my hands, and yet I felt happy, a feeling I had not had in so long. I couldn't even remember when. It would soon be over one way or another. I really didn't mind if I died like this, fighting, and if I lived, they would be our prisoners. An explosion ripped through the camp. The two guards at the gate whirled around, guns pointed in our direction. Father and I shot. They fell. The guard in the tower began to fire. Father cried out and clutched his arm. I raised my gun and shot. The guard fell from the tower with a scream. Father, are you all right? Yes, it's just my arm. Careful now. You must check the guards and get their guns. Cautiously, I moved towards them. One was dead. One was breathing heavily, blood pouring from a wound in his side. He looked up at me. Help me, he said. Why? I answered. I'm just a filthy Jew. You wouldn't want my help. Father had moved up behind me. Tie a cloth around his wound, Daniel, he said. Every live Nazi is one more we can put on trial. I did what he said. I'm not proud of my reaction, but the hatred and triumph I felt at that moment were stronger than any feeling of kindness. Daniel, my father said to me as I tied the German's wound, we are not like them. If they've made us into them, they've succeeded. I know, I replied, but I still would have liked to have shot them all and seen them suffer first. Come on, Father, I said. We went into the camp. It was all over, and so quickly. It was hard to believe. The SS were surrounded and held in barracks or had run away, too scared to fight. The prisoners had control of the camp. A white flag made out of tattered bedsheet was being raised on the flagpole so that the Americans wouldn't come in shooting. There is something I have to do, I said to Father, who was being cared for by a prisoner who was a doctor. I left him and went looking for my model SS officer. I found him in his house, a prisoner with a gun guarding him. May I speak with him? I asked his guard. Of course, the man replied. Gun in hand, I rushed over to one of the little girls and picked her up. Don't worry, I whispered in her ear. This is only pretend. She nodded and screamed, unafraid. No! Screamed her mother. The little boy you shot to death, he had just as much right to live as your child, I said quietly, all my rage pouring out. A life for a life? I waited a moment, but the officer didn't flinch. Then I put the child down and pointed the gun at the SS man's head. Fear sprang into his eyes, and his daughter began to cry. I'll be there to testify at your trial, I promised the officer. Then I left. What did I think I could accomplish with that? Teach them something? It was foolish and stupid and mean. They would never learn. They would always believe that our lives had been worthless and that they were not murderers, just simple folks carrying out orders to wipe out a subhuman species. I stalked away, feeling dirty and miserable. When I got back to my father, he smiled at me and motioned me over to him. With his good arm, he gave me a hug. It's over, Daniel, he said. It's over. And then I realized that he was right. We were free and alive. I sank down beside him, unable to feel anything but an immense sense of relief, perhaps happiness would come later.